This is not a talk about whether you should remarry. It is a deeper inquiry, one that cuts beneath romance, beneath companionship, and even beneath the idea of happiness itself. This is a talk about structure, responsibility, and ultimately consciousness, especially for a woman in her 40s with a child. Remarriage is not the continuation of love. It is the reconstruction of reality. In your 20s, love is exploration. In your 30s, it becomes selection. But in your 40s, particularly with a child, it becomes architecture. You are no longer choosing a partner. You are redesigning a system, a living, breathing system that includes emotional bonds, economic stability, and psychological safety. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Love may involve two people, but remarriage always involves at least three. And in that structure, the most vulnerable node is always the child. So let us be precise about our objective here. This conversation serves three purposes. First, to illuminate the hidden risks that must not be ignored. Second, to provide a structural framework for decision-making. Third, to shift your axis of choice from emotion to conscious awareness. Because if you make this decision emotionally, you may feel right and still build something fundamentally unstable. Let us begin with the first critical danger: fear-based decision-making, loneliness, financial anxiety, the quiet dread of aging alone, the pressure to give your child a father. These are powerful emotional forces. But if they become the origin point of your decision, your perception becomes distorted. Fear has a peculiar cognitive effect. It makes dominance look like stability. It makes control feel like protection. It makes intensity appear as love. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a profound warning. Do not mistake the illusions born of fear for reality. This applies not only to death, but to relationships. Attraction that emerges from fear is not destiny. It is projection. And projection, if unexamined, becomes repetition. The second danger: treating the child as a persuasion target. You may say, I deserve happiness too. That is true. But if your child is not emotionally prepared, your happiness can become their loss. Children are not persuaded by logic. They are calibrated by safety. They do not evaluate a man based on his words. They read his tone of voice, his micro-expressions, his capacity to regulate anger. A child's brain is not asking, is this man good for my mother? It is asking, am I safe in his presence? And if the answer is uncertain, no amount of reasoning will override that signal. The third danger: the illusion of transformation. Many believe, I can change him. This is one of the most persistent and dangerous cognitive distortions in intimate relationships. Personality structures do not dissolve under affection. They adapt. A controlling personality becomes more sophisticated. A volatile temperament becomes more concealed. A dependent personality becomes more strategic. Time does not change people. Repetition reinforces them. So the question becomes, what should you actually observe? Not feelings, not promises, but patterns. Look beyond what is said. Look at what is repeated. Not a single act of kindness, but behavior under stress. Not moments of harmony, but responses to conflict. Because character is not revealed in comfort, it is revealed in friction. Observe him in the presence of your child. This is the single most diagnostic environment. Ask yourself, does he respect the child as an autonomous individual? Does he attempt to control or dominate? Does he subtly compete for emotional territory? A person's behavior toward a child is not situational. It is essential. It reveals their underlying model of power, empathy, and boundaries. Separate emotional union from economic structure. This is where many fail. Marriage may be emotional integration, but assets are a system of accountability. Be vigilant about joint ownership pressures, beneficiary changes, financial dependency patterns. These are not expressions of love. They are risk indicators. Now, pause and ask yourself one question with absolute honesty. Am I choosing this because I love or because I am afraid? If you cannot answer that clearly, you are not making a decision. You are reacting. And reactions tend to repeat themselves, just as cycles repeat in what Buddhist philosophy describes as samsara. Remarriage is not fate. It is consciousness. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the quality of one's consciousness determines the nature of the next existence. The same principle applies here. If your awareness is clouded, patterns repeat. If your awareness is clear, patterns break. This is not mystical, it is psychological. Unconscious fear leads to unconscious selection. Conscious clarity leads to structural stability. And now we must go deeper. Because for a woman in her 40s with a child, remarriage is not merely a personal decision. It is a multivariable system redesign. The priorities shift. 1. The emotional safety of the child. 2. The stability of the caregiving environment. 3. The sustainability of financial structure. 4. The minimization of conflict with existing parental frameworks. If you do not understand this structure, failure is not a possibility, it is a probability. The psychological tension at the core. There is an inherent duality. You seek companionship, but you must ensure protection. This creates a subconscious shift. You are not evaluating a man only as a partner, but as a secondary guardian. And this is where misjudgments often occur, because the criteria become blurred between emotional attraction and protective suitability. 3 core psychological archetypes. Let us briefly frame them. First, the protection-oriented type. This individual prioritizes the child above all. She evaluates moral character, anger regulation, behavioral consistency toward the child, strength, high caution, risk emotional exhaustion or relational stagnation. Second, the economic stability type, driven by structural survival needs, focus, job stability, assets and long-term planning, financial predictability, strength, rational structure, risk emotional incompatibility with the child. Third, the compensation type, seeks to fill the absence of a father figure, drawn to warmth, playfulness, immediate rapport with the child, strength, emotional bonding, risk long-term inconsistency or hidden control dynamics. Each of these is not wrong, but each carries a distinct failure mode if not balanced. Final thought. A woman in this position is not simply choosing a man. She is choosing the emotional climate her child will grow up in, the psychological patterns that will be normalized, the structure of her future reality. This is not about love. Love is only one variable. This is about clarity, because responsibility does not begin with emotion. It begins with awareness. If this perspective resonates with you, consider reflecting further and share this with someone who may need clarity at a critical decision point. Because sometimes the difference between repetition and transformation is a single moment of awareness. So, as we concluded earlier, remarriage in your 40s, especially with a child, is not a question of love. It is a question of consciousness, structure, and responsibility. And once we understand that, we must confront the uncomfortable reality. Not all relationships fail because of incompatibility. Some fail because they were structurally destined to collapse from the beginning. Let us now examine those structures more closely. The second failure structure, the violent personality. When we say violence, most people imagine physical harm. But in psychological terms, violence is far broader. It includes verbal aggression, destruction of objects, intimidation through atmosphere. In a household with a child, this is not merely conflict between adults. It is emotional abuse of the child. And when a man repeatedly implies, "This is not my child," the family is no longer a system, it is already fragmenting. Here is the critical principle. Violence does not decrease over time. It evolves and strengthens. Why? Because every successful act of control becomes reinforcement. Consider three concrete behavioral patterns. First, throwing objects during anger. A cup, a remote control, a chair. Even if no one is physically harmed, this is not harmless expression. It is pre-violence signaling. For a child, the message is immediate. I could be next. Second, intentional destruction of personal belongings. Breaking a phone, destroying a child's toy. This is not impulsive, it is strategic. It communicates. If you do not comply, consequences will follow. This is control, not emotion. Third, damaging the physical environment. Punching walls, kicking doors. This behavior destabilizes the very concept of home. A home is supposed to be a secure base, but here, the space itself becomes unpredictable, unsafe. Now let us examine atmospheric violence, which is often more insidious. First, silence as punishment. Days without communication. Cold, deliberate, emotional withdrawal. This is not distance. It is psychological isolation as control. Second, excessive monitoring and restriction. Checking phone calls. Limiting movement. This is not care. It is domination disguised as concern. Third, physical intimidation without contact. Raising a hand, cornering someone against a wall. Even without physical impact, the brain begins to encode fear. And once fear is learned, it does not easily unlearn. Why does this destroy a family? Here, the insight from the Tibetan Book of the Dead becomes relevant. It teaches that in transitional states, the mind amplifies fear into overwhelming realities. In psychological terms, fear is not just experienced, it is magnified internally. In a violent household, the child lives in constant tension. The mind replays fear repeatedly. The emotional environment becomes what we might call a living bardo, a state of psychological hell. Second, anger reinforces itself. Every act of aggression that achieves control strengthens the behavioral loop. Violence is not random. It is learned, rewarded, and repeated. Third, when safety collapses, attachment collapses. A child cannot form secure emotional bonds in survival mode. And without attachment, there is no real family-only coexistence. Let us summarize clearly. Verbal violence destroys identity. Object destruction teaches fear. Threatening environments activate survival mode. Rejection or discrimination destroys the child's sense of self. At that point, the family is no longer built on love. It is maintained by fear memory. And once that happens, collapse is not future tense. It is already in progress. The third failure structure, alcohol dependency. Now we move to another critical pattern, one that appears socially normalized, yet structurally devastating. Alcohol dependency does not just affect the individual. It dismantles the authority structure of the family. And authority in a healthy system is not about power. It is about trust, predictability, and protection. When alcohol erodes these, three failures emerge. First, broken promises. I'll be there. I won't drink tonight. I'll take care of it. Repeatedly broken. Authority collapses the moment words lose credibility. Second, financial instability. Missed payments, debt accumulation, irresponsible spending. The foundation of survival becomes unstable, and the child learns this environment is not secure. Third, threatening unpredictability. loud voices, sudden anger, late-night disruptions. Authority is replaced not by respect, but by fear. The mechanism is simple. Trust collapses. Protection weakens. Fear increases. Structure dissolves. For a child, the psychological consequences are precise. Unpredictability anxiety, economic instability, survival insecurity, repeated fear, chronic hypervigilance, and when the brain enters survival mode, focus declines, aggression increases, depression emerges. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of environment. Again, the philosophical parallel is clear. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it is said, when one cannot recognize clarity, the mind is overwhelmed by fear. Children are the same. They are born with clarity, but repeated fear reshapes perception. The fourth failure structure, economic parasitism. Now we arrive at a quieter but equally dangerous pattern. The financially dependent or parasitic partner. This type does not immediately appear harmful. In fact, early on, he often presents vision, plans, opportunities, future success. But look closer. The pattern includes requests for investment capital, pressure for joint ownership, demands to change insurance beneficiaries, reliance on your financial instruments. These are not signs of partnership. They are entry points into your asset structure. At the psychological level, this pattern often combines inflated self-perception, dependency, anxiety, entitlement, beliefs, control over future security. From a philosophical lens, this aligns with three classical distortions. Attachment to material security, ignorance of one's own instability, repetition of unresolved behavioral patterns, again as reflected in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Unresolved tendencies do not disappear. They recur. The core conclusion. At this point, we must be direct. Jealous control, violence, addiction, financial parasitism. These are not temporary problems. They are personality structures. And personality structures are not corrected by love. The greatest illusion in remarriage is this: I can change him. You cannot. Because behavior is not driven by emotion alone. It is driven by repeated patterns of consciousness. And here is the final layer of the question. Why do these patterns repeat? Why does control feel like stability? Why does jealousy feel like love? Why does fear feel like attachment? Because, as the Tibetan Book of the Dead suggests, we move toward what is familiar, not what is healthy, even if that familiarity once caused pain. This is the mechanism of repetition. Unconscious pattern, familiar attraction, repeated outcome. But the moment you recognize the pattern, the cycle can stop. Closing transition. In the next part of this series, we will go deeper not into the analysis of others, but into self-awareness. We will examine why strong men feel safe, why past relationship patterns repeat, why emotional scarcity leads to compromised decisions, and the essential questions you must ask before remarriage, because you cannot control who appears in your life, but you can control the criteria by which you choose. Remarriage is not a second attempt at love. It is an upgrade in consciousness. Your child does not need a perfect father. They need a stable environment. Love does not need to be intense, but structure must be secure, because emotions pass, but environments repeat, and repetition builds a life. If this perspective helped you see more clearly, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this with someone who may be standing at a critical decision point. In the next lecture, we go deeper into the architecture of choice itself. Thank you.